will tell you that we're so excited to have Fred Dylla as our guest today. Pam White, who's our president of our board, had recommended Fred as a friend. And when I started reading about him, neat to find a combination of a physicist and an artist with a, Fred's got a 50-year career in science. And so we often start out with a quote. And I found this because I too studied science in college and love art. Science and art tend to coalesce in aesthetics, plasticity, and form. The greatest scientists are artists as well. And Fred, you may know this one already, but that is Albert Einstein. And so we want to welcome Fred today to talk not only maybe a little about science, but mostly about art and his Whiteline woodcuts, which have been shown in our 3-state area and beyond. And the fact that he has taught this medium, and he's going to give us a little history about the medium and the Provincetown printers. And I loved the part of his bio that said he was inspired to get involved because of his daughters and finding that connection with them. So thank you for being here today. The rest of you will notice I've kind of, everybody's muted for now, so Fred can give his presentation. He's going to share his screen, but you can ask questions in the chat, and then when Fred's done presenting, we can all talk with him and have a little intimate conversation. So thank you all for being here, and thanks, Fred.
Thank you, Anne. So have you shared screens? Okay. Let me find my talk here. And we'll, okay, I hope everybody can see that. If you can't see it, grimace, okay? I'm happy to join the salon tonight. A salon to me is a time to relax. I appreciated Maria's remarks that we could all use the sustenance and the calming effect of either enjoying art or doing art. So if you have something to toast at happy hour, please do sit back and enjoy the next 45 minutes. I'm happy to have Pam White on, who's one of my former students in this art form, and Lorraine Quinn, who's one of my existing students in this art form. And we had our weekly salon in Lewis yesterday. So what I hope to do for those of you who are not familiar with the technique or only slightly familiar with the technique is to give you a brief history of this uniquely American art form. And Anne was right. She noticed in my biography that I've spent most of my life as a physicist. Once you're a physicist, you're always a physicist. But physicist or any scientist tends to enjoy many things. I got interested in art when my two daughters started painting when they were 6 and 7, and they never stopped. They're both graduates of the University of Virginia Fine Art School. And 20 years ago, my wife, Linda, and I started taking watercolor lessons so we could have something to talk about with our daughters. And I must say they were intense critics. I would put something in front of them, and after they got off the floor in fits of laughter, they told me to turn over my piece of work, and I had to endure about 10 minutes of intense critique. Well, 5 years into this torture, I finally showed them one of a Provincetown type print I did, and they said, not bad, Dad. And then they said, turn it over. And I got my usual lecture on content and color balance. But what I'm going to tell you about is the art form that I fell in love with that was invented over a century ago in Provincetown. And this is a lecture that I use when I teach the technique in a 3-day workshop. And I'm happy to do that in RiverArts the next time you want to invite me up. And you'll see the byline is both my byline and my friend and colleague Bill Lavall that I'll tell you more about as we go on. So let me first tell you about Provincetown. It's the nation's oldest art colony. It was founded by Charles Hawthorne as the Cape Cod School of Art in 1899. And then about 15 years later, the Provincetown Art Association was founded, which still is there. It's now called the Provincetown Art Association and Museum. And if you're ever up to the tip of Cape Cod, it's a wonderful museum. And why was this our first art colony? And it still is a mecca for artists. It is just a wonderful environment, especially in the summer. The winter, you have to be toughened. But in the summer, the combination of the sea on all three sides of you, a beautiful bay coast, a lovely ocean coast, and what the artists call this incredible northern light has helped it be inspirational for artists. And here's an old picture of painting in plein air on the Provincetown beach. It's still a wonderful place to either visit, to look at, enjoy, and buy art, or to go up and take a class. So let's see if I can. So I'm going to tell you about a form of woodblock printing that was invented at Provincetown, but this is actually the world's oldest art form. There are examples that are survived from the 3rd century. Sorry about that phone. I don't know how to stop it. And of course, if you're familiar with the early hand-drawn editions of the Bible the monks did in the Middle Ages, the illustrations were done by wood blocks, carved pieces of wood with the illustration that was inked and stamped. The art form was really perfected in the 17th and 19th century, the so-called Edo period in Japan. And you may have seen famous Japanese wood blocks like this one called the Wave. Okay, that's been printed on postcards and posters and t-shirts. That was done by Hokusai. And you'll find one of the original versions of that in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And a good copy of that print just sold in Sotheby's, I think, for about $20,000. So you can still get those. This was an art form that is very difficult to do because you have to first envision a scene, and then you divide the scene into its constituent colors, and then an individual block of wood is cut for every color. And then that particular block color is inked, and that's pressed onto a unique form of paper that the Japanese invented. It's typically made from the inner bark of a mulberry bush. And then, as you can imagine, if you have a multicolor scene, and a typical Japanese print like the one I just showed you might have 14 blocks. And so you have to be careful to register each one of those blocks, or you get a mishmash. So there's a fairly careful system using a key block that made sure that's all registered. That's a lot of work, but you end up with these beautiful prints. They were greatly admired by the artists you know very well in the late 19th century and 20th century, particularly in France. If you've ever gone to Giverny, to Monet's garden house, his house has 200 Japanese prints hanging on the wall. And you'll find Van Gogh paintings where he has done a copy of a Japanese woodblock print. Well, many of American artists or American immigrant artists would spend time at Provincetown because it was a wonderful place to spend the summer, and then go to Paris for the winter. Actually, nice life, right? I wouldn't mind that. And they studied the Japanese woodblock printing, both in the English schools and the French schools. Well, you all know what happened in 1914 and 1915. World War I interrupted this very nice lifestyle. And it turned out a small group of these artists who would spend summer in Provincetown found themselves spending the winter of 1915 and 1960 in Provincetown. And one of these artists was a Swedish-American artist called Nordfeld. That was his B.J.O. Nordfeld. And he had learned the Japanese technique, and he was joined by a couple of other artists. Turns out they were all women: Juliet Nichols, Edna Boyce Hopkins, Ethel Mars, Maud Squire, Ada Gilmore, Dolly Macmillan. And these were artists that also spent time in Paris, knew something about woodblock printing. Several of them had studied in the Pratt Institute, New York, under Arthur Wesley Dow, who is probably this country's most famous art teacher. The 26th version of his book is still in print and used in most art schools. And so here you had a group of artists stuck in Provincetown over this winter who were enamored with the Japanese woodcut. But it was too hard. It's too much work making all these different blocks. Okay? So Mr. Nordfeld is usually credited with inventing what's called the Whiteline woodblock technique. And even though it was a group effort, it was Nordfeld who apparently walked in one day with a full color print made with one block of wood. And here's a quote from an art historian. Immediately, woodblock printing was revolutionized. Being able to see the complete picture on one piece of wood, like a painting on a canvas, gave new possibilities for creative work in that medium. Now, can you imagine what it was like making a full color woodblock print where you had a different block for every color? You could never see the full print until it was all done, and that might be days later. Okay, but here with this technique, you completely shortened that. So it was over the winter that these 7 artists invented the technique, and then in May of when the winter thawed, they took a group of their first prints to New York City for their first unveiling. And later that summer, the same show was shown in Provincetown. And that same summer, 2 other very, very well-known artists, Oliver Chaffee and Blanche Lazelle, and you're going to hear more about that lady, joined the group. So here's what one of these prints would look like. This is an early one from Nordfeld. It's called Mending the Boat. And you can probably see, even the resolution of your screen, you see a little white line outlining the mountains, a little white line between the green of the sea and the purple of the beach and along the houses. And so what was done is first sketching that scene on a wooden block and then carving a white line between every major shape. And then I'll show you how they do the prints with a little larger one. And here's an earlier watercolor from Nordfeld, and you can see how the technique could go from here on your right to here on your left. Here's the watercolor, and he had outlined it with probably just a small brush called a rigger and black paint or an ink pen. And you can see translating those black lines to a white carved line would allow you to do this technique. What else do you see when you see these 2 examples in front of you? You see bright colors. You see a rather flat perspective. And you see just a lovely geometric form in front of you, whether it's a landscape or people. It's very simple, but it's captivating as an art form. So the group has been called, since that fateful winter, the Provincetown Printers. Unfortunately, it saw its peak popularity that very next summer with the local exhibitions I told you about, and the one in New York. And from that point on, the group was called the Provincetown Printers, the Provincetown Printmakers. And this is the founding group right here. The most famous of these artists, you may have heard about. Her name is Blanche Lazelle. She lived from 1878 to 1956. She had her art degree from West Virginia University, studied the Art Students League, a very famous place to study at the turn of the century, also in Paris. And she may have interacted with one of the other ladies I told you about from Cincinnati, Edna Boys Hopkins. And she joined that group in 1914 and made her first print with the second member of the group I told you about, Oliver Chaffee. And from that point on, she never left that art form. She had several subsequent visits to Paris in the 20s, and she got enthralled with Cubism. And in fact, after her life ended in 1956, she is believed to be the first artist who really brought Cubism back to America. And she experimented with a lot of her prints. This is a famous one called Monongahela, since she was born in West Virginia. She knows that river. And just look at the arcs of the sky and the arcs of the mountains and the arcs of the river here. It's very Cubist abstraction of that scene. By the time she died, she had made over 500 prints from over 120 blocks. And it's unfortunately that she did not get known until well after her death. Typically, her prints would be sold to a tourist coming over from Boston for a few dollars each. If you find one now, they go from $20,000 to $50,000. Her prints are in the Phillips Museum in Washington. They're in the Smithsonian. They're in the Boston Museum of Arts. And fortunately, she was also a very good record keeper. And most of her records are now kept in the archive at her university, at West Virginia University. Now, here's the unfortunate part. Here's this uniquely American art form, and it started out with such a bang in 1915, 1916 with these shows in New York, and it basically was forgotten for almost 50 years. I should go back and tell you that one of her last students was called Farrell Sibley Warthen. And that was in the 1950s when she was in her 70s. Farrell Sibley Warthen lived until about 20 years ago. And I want you to keep that in mind. So the technique was largely dormant for 50 years. And a couple of people started to ask questions about this unique art form in the late 70s, including a fellow by the name of Bill Laval, who was introduced to Farrell Warthen by an artist in town, Myron Stout, and he began making Whiteline woodcut prints just by a few lessons from Miss Warthen. But turns out that Bill was a real printmaker. He studied at the Pratt Institute. He knew how to make prints by a variety of techniques, and he got very interested in the white line technique. And about the same time, another Provincetown artist discovered that there was quite a collection of these things lying dormant at the Provincetown Art Association in their archives. And they organized a show on the Provincetown printers, and it opened at the Provincetown Art Association and Museum in 1982, and it went to the National Museum of American Art. And it was curated by one of the best curators of prints in the country, Janet Flint. This is a book you can still find, this catalog on eBay. I'm sure it was $5 at the time of the 1982 show, and you're lucky if you find it for $100 now. But from that time on, Bill Lavall and Worthen's granddaughter, Catherine Smith, almost single-handedly revived the technique by mentoring students in the Provincetown Art Association and teaching in the Provincetown Art Association and in their own studios. Now, how do I know so much? Let me first tell you how it works, and then I'll come back to Bill. So here's how it works. You take a piece of wood. It needs to be flat. Okay. One of the things that Bill Lavall did was teach people how to use plywood, so you wouldn't be limited to the size of block of wood you could find. In Blanche Lazelle's day, it was easy to find a 16-inch wide piece of soft northern pine. That's not so easy these days. So the first thing is to imagine a scene or copy a scene, and you sketch it with a pencil or a piece of graphite on a wooden block. And then every edge of the scene you carve out with a knife. So this is one of my prints of famous Portland Head Lighthouse up in Maine. And what you do is just carve the lines between every segmented scene, like the roof, the windows, the rocks, the clouds. And where you want white space, you don't carve out and you don't put paint on. And then the next thing you do is pin a piece of watercolor paper or the original Japanese paper on one side of the block. And then you apply paint on one area, say the roof, red paint. Then you fold the piece of paper over and you rub the back of the paper, and that transfers the paint to the paper. One color and one segment at a time, but you're still using just one block. And the print you see here has many layers of grays and blues and reds and tans. So you might be applying paint and folding the paper over and rubbing the back of it 500 times. And then you end up with a unique print that you don't have to number, because there's no way any artist could remember exactly how he or she would put the paint down. So when you're done, you have a color print that is a unique piece of art, and you don't have to number it. Whereas if you looked at a standard woodcut or a lithograph, they're all identical and they'd be numbered. It might be a limited edition, but here they don't have to be numbered. So here is Bill Lavall standing over a piece of wood, showing off one of my prints in his studio up in Provincetown. So how did I get to know Bill? I happened to see a show on the Provincetown printers that was done in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in 2002. February of 2002, I remember it because it was very cold and you couldn't wait to get in the museum to warm up. But we walked into this room, my wife Linda and I, and the room was filled with these lovely prints from the original Provincetown printers, a lot from Blanche Lazelle. And they were just gorgeous. We couldn't get over them. And we said, we've got to go to Provincetown and find some of these. So what we did was rent a room and went there the next summer. And we went into an art gallery and we were thrilled to find prints by Blanche Lazelle and some of the other Provincetown printers laying on the floor, stacked up. I picked one up. I said, Linda, a Blanche Lazelle print. Maybe we can buy one. I turned it over. It was $20,000 in 2002. Out of my league. So we walked out of we're about to walk out of the gallery with our tails between our legs. And we picked up a local Cape Cod Art Museum book. And on the cover was this guy, Bill Lavall. And we turned to the article and it says, Bill Lavall teaches Whiteline woodcuts here in Provincetown, and he and his wife Skipper run a B&B in Truro. So we said, let's go to Truro. well, to cut a long story short, by the time we found the B&B and knocked on the door and opened the door, Bill took one look at me. I took one look at him. We were Boy Scouts together in New Jersey 50 years ago. We hadn't seen each other in almost 30 years. So since that day, we've been fast friends. I've been going up there every year to take lessons on woodcut printing from him. So he learned from Farrell Warthen. Farrell Warthen learned from Blanche Lazelle. I've learned from Bill. So I'm kind of a fourth generation Whiteline woodcutter printer. Bill teaches me how to do woodcut prints, and he joined our local art salon by Zoom in Lewis every Monday. And I pay him back by teaching him physics. So it's been a wonderful friendship. So here you can see the last part of the technique, just applying regular watercolor paint to the block. And here's a piece of the paper pinned to one side. You can see that area of yellow. I'm adding another layer of yellow on you do that. So there's a little bit of a technique. If you let the paint dry too much, it won't transfer. And if it's too wet, it may run over the lines. But Pam can tell you, because she's taken my class, it doesn't take long to learn the technique. And as with any standard watercolor technique, you can build up many layers of paint and texture. And so you, on the actual print itself, it looks like a watercolor. And as I mentioned, it's a unique work of art, and you don't have to number them. Here's one of Bill's famous prints called Dancing Houses. He has 3 versions of this. By size, the largest one is almost a yard long. Since he was a lithographer, he has learned to make a way to raise pieces of paper a yard wide and carefully lay them down on the block. Most woodblock printers are comfortable with working with something 10 by 12, but Bill is unique in doing these very large ones. So let me show you a few, and then we can open up the floor for questions. This is, let me move my thing down. This is one of Blanche's early prints called Two Boats, just made 3 years after she joined the group. Again, you see it sort of has a 2D perspective, but it's very geometric and very colorful, and you sort of disobey the rules of realistic shapes and realistic colors to get these colors and shapes to bounce out to your eye. I think I have a couple more. Here's one from 1933, just called Tulips. And you can see the Cubist influence that she imparted to her prints after her 1920s trip, sojourn in Paris. And you can see this is the standard way that the printers would note. They would put the title in pencil on the left-hand side of the print, and then their name and a date on the others. I mentioned that Blanche has done over 500 prints from 150 blocks. She was meticulous in archiving what she did. On the back of each block, she would give a number and a date for when she carved the block, and she would give a number and a date for when she did prints on a block. And if she did 150 prints and 500 prints and 150 blocks, typically she only did 2 or 3 prints per block. So that was a lot of carving in her lifetime. Here's one of mine. Since I live in Lewis, a seacoast town, people love lighthouses. This is not a Lewis lighthouse. This is a lighthouse on Vancouver Bay, but I fell in love with a scene on a postcard of the lifeboat being ready to be launched. And this is quite large. That's probably 20 inches by 27 inches or so. And I've picked up Bill's love of doing larger prints using pieces of plywood. Here's another one of mine called Hopkinsons Race, and it's modeled after an old watercolor done in the 1930s by Charles Hopkinson, who was really a portrait painter. He painted the portraits of most of the Harvard University presidents from the turn of the century to about 1950, but occasionally he did a landscape. And I got permission to use his watercolor as a scene from his son, who is a physicist at MIT like I was. So sometimes these connections help. So if you want to go see these things, the best place to see him is to take a trip up to Provincetown in the late spring, the summer, or early fall. It's pretty wet and cold in the winter. Provincetown Art Association Museum and the Pilgrim Museum have fantastic collections. And so does the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and a little closer, as I mentioned, the Smithsonian and the Phillips Gallery. And there are 2 galleries in Provincetown and 1 in Boston that are well known for handling these things. If you want to watch something on television, HBO had a documentary in 2017 called Packed in a Trunk about a very not well-known Provincetown printer called Edith Lake Wilkinson. And Edith's niece found in a trunk in her family house a bunch of her prints. And the documentary explores whether she would have been one of the earliest Whiteline wood printers. She was, and you'll get to see Bill on that too. If you'd like to learn how to do this technique, I encourage you to take the course that I once gave at Chestertown, and I hope to give whenever you'd like to organize one again. And I show you it's pretty easy to do. If you've ever sketched and know a little bit about watercolor painting, you can do this. I teach you how to do the carving and the printing and the sketching and the transferring. And almost every one of my students after the first day is making their first print. And if you don't believe me, you're going to ask Pam. The printing paper is available in most art stores. You can use standard high-grade watercolor paper. I tend to prefer one of the original Japanese papers. It's called Hosho, and it's not that expensive. It's about $6, and most of the better art stores carry it. Carving tools, I don't know if you've ever used an X-Acto knife. They're miserable. They hurt your hand. And this thing called a flex cut doesn't hurt your hand. And if you take my course, I give you one. And if you want to learn more, here are some references for this talk. And most importantly, invite you to come to either one of the courses that are being held next month in Rehoboth. Beautiful time to come to Rehoboth. The tourists aren't there yet. I do a 3-day introductory course for people who have never touched printing or wood carving and know a little bit about sketching. And then if you want to join a next level course, that's the following week. And you can just contact the Art League. There's plenty of room in both courses. So that's it. I'm happy to answer questions, and I hope I entertained you. And if I said something wrong, maybe Lorraine will correct me. She's been listening to me for 2 years.
Fred, that was wonderful. I really don't know.
We're losing your audio a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I think I can speak up and say that that was really fascinating. I knew nothing other than what I had read on our webpage, and that was great. I loved seeing all that, and I'm eager to hear. Maybe there's people who have actually had some experience who have more intelligent questions than I will.
Thank you.
Well, I'm interested, why did this never become popular or just was popular for such a short time?
I don't think there's a good reason. At least I haven't found one. I have a feeling that the American art world turned to modernist painting right after World War I. And in fact, several of the artists that I mentioned, like Nordfeld, BJO Nordfeld, went out to Santa Fe and did very little printing, but is famous for his watercolors. And Oliver Chaffee, another one that I mentioned, is well known for his painting. So I think even this group, except for Blanche, just abandoned it. And when there was a small group of people, the art world took off into other forms. Now, when it was rediscovered, I think it is now much more popular than it was done in 1915, but it's still highly regional. You know it if you have learned a little bit about it and if you've been up to Provincetown. But certainly when I began teaching it down here in Chesapeake region 3 years ago, people knew nothing about it. They never heard about it. So I don't really know the answer to your question, Pam.
Hi, I'm Betsy Marshall. I'm not in Chestertown. I go to Chestertown quite a bit, or though not as much as I used to, because my daughter graduated from WAC and she's doesn't go there all the time. And I bring hello from New Jersey and from Princeton, which is, I'm surrounded by physicists at the moment. So I'm sure we have many, we know people in common. But anyway, I have a couple of technical questions. I just really like woodcuts. That's why I came in. And so one question is, if I get you correctly, you leave the white space is the negative in the wood block. Is that correct?
That's correct. So you can either, certainly when you carve a line, the paint is not taken up by the line. You take the paint right to the line, so it prints white. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other way you could get white space is just not put paint on an area.
Okay.
So
Okay.
there's two ways you can get white space.
I see. Okay. And then the second question is has this been done with things other than wood or with different kinds of wood or that kind of thing?
Good question. It works best with wood that you can carve relatively easily for, I think, two reasons. If you look closely at any of the prints, and you really can't looking at the screen, okay? But what you find is that they have this captivating texture that is a combination of two things. It is the wood grain showing up on the print. And because as the paint lays on the wood, depending on the grain, the paint is soaked up more into an open grain or a soft grain than a line of a hard grain. And it picks up the texture of these Japanese papers. And so you have these two textures that give you a very interesting complexity to the print. One of the members of our local Lewis salon is a standard printmaker, meaning that he carves wood blocks or linoleum blocks and inks them in one color and then presses it in a print. And he has tried doing a Whiteline woodcut on some plastics, and it doesn't work because the paint smears. So you really need the porosity of the wood for two reasons. So it absorbs a little paint, and secondly, gives it back with the graininess. And even with the Japanese wood blocks, if you looked at many of those prints, many of the artists took advantage of the grain of the wood and used that for lines in the sky or lines in the sea.
Mm-hmm.
So now the wood, the Japanese used cherry, which is a superb wood to carve because it has a very fine grain, but it's also very hard, okay? I use furniture grade birch plywood, which has a fine grain, so you can make fine features. You can also get it any size. But
Right.
it's a little harder to carve. And some of my students have been investing in a form of basswood, which is the softest wood known to nature, and it's very
Uh-huh.
easy to carve. It carves like butter.
Okay.
But I've been trying for a year to find basswood plywood. I found
Uh-huh.
one Canadian company, but because of the tariffs, I haven't been able to get any.
Yeah. Huh.
So
So-
that typically the wood to use is either basswood or cherry or birch.
Okay. And then I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand. So you, when you do the painting, you paint all the sectors at once, and then you put piece of paper, but how do you, so you
No,
have it very well marked, or forget the, I forget the
Yeah.
name word. but
good
you have to-
question. So once you have a scene on a woodblock that you've sketched, you carved out every line. And now let's go back to one of the scenes, the roof of the lighthouse I showed you. It was red. So you would, first of all, pin a piece of paper to one side of the woodblock so it can't move. All it can do is go back and forth. Okay.
Okay.
So now you put red paint on that roof area, and you
Mhm.
fold the piece of paper over and you rub the back of it.
Okay.
The Provincetown printers use silver spoons. I use a venerable maple doorknob.
Right
You
here.
can
course.
use your hand, okay? My friend Lorraine is holding up the doorknobs that I give to every student, okay?
Oh, okay. Good
Okay,
idea.
And so you apply paint to one segment and one color at a time.
Okay.
Then you would go back to that roof and say, I don't want it just to be red. I want a little black or brown staining along the eave. And so you can add that just like you do a watercolor.
Okay.
But typically do one segment, one color at a time. And it depends on the scene, whether you go lights to dark or darks to light.
Okay. Thank you.
All good questions, Elizabeth. You should take our course. You'd enjoy
Yeah, I
it.
don't know. I have really weak, I did take a woodcut class, and I don't have the greatest hands. I have like a lot of too much typing or something. And so I have problems with my hands. And so I don't
Well,
know if I
there,
could do woodcuts for more
my
than an
my
hour or
fellow
two, but
students have similar problems, and so going to the softer wood, and especially this
Mhm.
ergonomic knife I give to them,
okay.
it really helps. And the other thing that helps is that you're going
go.
from
Very nice.
drawing to carving to painting to
Mhm.
printing. And so
Okay,
there's
so
a
you're not
lot of
doing
exercises
carving.
on your hand, okay?
Yeah, yeah.
And then the
Well,
third
it
thing I
sounds like
tell
fun.
students is don't stick with one. Have a
Yeah.
couple going, so you have some in the print stage, some in the carving stage, some in the painting stage.
Well, it sounds nice. It'd be great to go to Lewis or Rehoboth, but maybe I can fit that one in.
Well, we'd love to have you.
Although I didn't know that I've been a fan of Arthur Wesley Dowell's prints. Actually, Rutgers Zimmerly had an American printmaker exhibit that had a lot of his prints.
Yes.
But I somehow didn't realize that he was like this Pratt icon, even though my son went to Pratt. So I paid for 4 years of Pratt, but didn't know that there was that connection.
So you're living in Princeton now?
Yes, I live in Princeton.
So the fellow who invented this technique, B.J.O. Northfeld, moved to Lambertville, 1937.
Wow.
And he bought an old farm, turned it into a studio. And so he spent the last 20 years of his life in Lambertville. So there are still some of the galleries up there that have Nordfeld artwork.
But probably not prints, but his other.
Yeah, because he gave up the prints. But I found
Okay,
an art
well,
gallery up there that had Dow prints for sale.
Oh, really?
And they went too quickly for me to get one.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that's outside my price range also, but.
Well, they were $10 to start with, and they were
Oh, really?
gone by the
Well,
time I got there.
gotta move fast.
Fred, I was wondering, when you showed us the print with the barn and the roof was red and then there was red maybe in the clouds or elsewhere. At first, it really didn't register with me that it's watercolor. I mean, that's
Right.
so different than printing with an acrylic or some,
Right.
another deeper tones. So I think now that you've, gone through it a few times, it's sinking in that the clouds is, one application or two or three of the pink and reds. But when you do the barn and it's more dark, you've maybe done that 20 times in terms of printing. Is that accurate?
Almost. So
Okay.
something like the sky, you might start out top of the sky being a light blue and the medium part of the sky a dark blue. So that's putting down a little bit of light blue paint on top, printing that, then a little darker blue, which means more paint, or you're rubbing it harder as you're going down. And then the bottom layer, you're probably putting down a little blue and then adding a little alizarin on top of it for that pinkish reddish that you're seeing. For the roof, that's a very saturated color. You're doing one of two things or both. You're putting down a lot of paint so that it's very saturated and pressing harder. And if it doesn't come out the way you want it, you put down another layer of paint and apply it again. As long as you haven't ripped that piece of paper off the block, you can go back and forth until you're happy with it.
Thank you.
So it shares many of the attributes of a watercolor in that you can layer the paint, but like a watercolor, you can easily mess it up if you put too much. So I always tell my students, go light, go light, go light. You can always make it slightly darker, but if you get it too dark, you got to rip the paper off and start over. But you'll learn from that.
I love the vibrancy of the colors, and then the white, the differentiation of segments with the white line around them just really does make things pop.
That's what I fell in love with. And I think I think one of the things that any of the people I've taught have loved is their aha moment when they make their first print, and not the finished print, but when they took one segment of their board, put some paint on it, folded the paper, rubbed the back, and then looked at that, and it just pops the first time you see it. Right, Lorraine?
Yes, I could agree.
Lauren, thank you for showing us the different tools. That was nice to
Oh,
see while
sure.
Fred was talking. And Fred, I was wondering also, like, you talk about sketching and then cutting and then printing. So I think if I've got this right, when you're printing and you lift up the paper, it is a reverse image of what you've drawn?
That's right. That's a reverse image. So you have to be careful if you really want it to be a realistic view of the Portland Head Lighthouse. When you do the sketch, you have to reverse it.
Right.
And the way I teach my students to do that is usually do a sketch on a piece of paper first. You're happy with it. And then transfer that sketch onto a piece of graphite paper just by rubbing the edge of the sketch with graphite underneath it. But now when you do on the board, you flip it over so that the real print is in the right way to see it. It normally doesn't matter unless you really want it to be that view of the lighthouse that you saw. Where it really does matter is if you put lettering. And unless you're a Da Vinci and know how to carve letters backwards, you have to learn how to flip the print over before you transfer it. But you have it right.
Thank you. I was wondering about that. Lorraine or anybody else, do you all have any other questions for Fred?
No questions, but comments. Like I said, it's a great variety from the drawing to the carving, painting, and then printing.
Yeah, makes it sound like there's a lot of fun, different things to learn along the way. Fred, we would absolutely love to have you in for teaching the class again. And I know it's going to come up soon at Rehoboth and people can do that, but boy, it sure would be fun. I would like to take it and learn. And I think there's a lot of our members who would.
Well, I enjoy your town. It's a wonderful town, and I'd love to come back. Just not the 2 weeks that we're in Rehoboth, because we've already got those booked. So
right.
Any
right.
other time it'd be fun.
Sounds wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here today. Fred, thank you. It was an amazing learning experience. And Pam, thank you for inviting
Thank you.
Fred.
Thank you,
Well, and
Fred.
I was gonna say, before we go, I think I'd like my last question, I was gonna really, ask Fred to explain about the new physics particles and muons,
That's what I wanted to ask too.
but maybe since we've already gone a few minutes over, we'll leave muons for another time. But I did want to toast to people who are scientists and artists both, because I think that's a winning combination.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you, Ann. Yeah.
Thank you.
And
Thank
Ray.
you.
Thanks,
Thank
Lorraine,
Thank
for
you,
chiming
Fred.
in. I
Seeing you again,
needed
yep.
you to do show and tell. That was very helpful.
Impromptu. Great to meet all of you. Thanks again.
Nice to see you all. Thank you
Thank you
so
for
much.
coming.
Thank you,
Bye.
Fred.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
Bye.